She was never really here, just floating around under the ocean somewhere, pretending her job mattered while I built a real life for this family. That was what my wife told our accountant as she tried to erase my ownership of the restaurant I had spent a decade paying for. To understand why I did not raise my voice and why the two people waiting quietly in the hallway were about to tear her entire reality apart, I have to go back. My name is Sarah. I am 46 years old, and for 20 years I wore the uniform of the United States Navy. I retired as a chief petty officer. My specialty was nuclear propulsion. I was a machinist's mate on fast-attack submarines. When most people think of a submarine, they imagine old movies with periscopes and quiet sonar screens. The reality of the engine room is much heavier and much more grueling. My life was a cramped steel tube hundreds of feet underwater. It was the constant grinding hum of a nuclear reactor. It was breathing recycled air that tasted like amine and machine oil. Sleeping in a rack the size of a coffin and working 12 to 18 hours a day to keep a billion-dollar machine safely operating in the dark. In my world, facts matter over feelings. You cannot argue with high-pressure steam. You cannot negotiate with the ocean. You either do the work correctly or people do not come home. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. That was the discipline that kept me alive, and it was the discipline I brought to my marriage. While I was operating under the ice, my wife Claire was building a very different kind of life topside. She was managing our home and raising our two children, a son and a daughter, who were now in their early 20s. But her true passion, her absolute dream, was hospitality. She wanted a sprawling, beautiful restaurant with exposed brick walls, warm lights, and a busy open kitchen. She had the vision, the aesthetic taste, and the local connections to make it happen. But she did not have the capital. I had the stable paycheck. Therefore, for 10 straight years, every extra dollar I earned went into that restaurant. When I received a $60,000 re-enlistment bonus, I signed the entire amount over to her to secure the commercial lease. Every hazard pay increase, every family separation allowance, and every C-pay bump was wired directly into our joint business account. I did not mind the sacrifice. Not because it was easy, because when you love someone, their mission becomes your mission. I ate powdered eggs in the middle of the Pacific Ocean so she could buy high-end commercial ovens. I slept on a thin foam mattress so she could afford imported tile for the dining room. When the main bar needed custom woodwork, I wired $12,000 from my deployment savings. When the industrial air conditioning unit failed during her opening summer, I quietly drained half of my personal emergency fund to cover the repair, so she would not lose sleep. I was the silent engine of our life. I funded the dream, and she became the face of it. If you have ever poured your entire soul into building a foundation for someone who conveniently forgot who paid for the bricks, you know exactly the kind of quiet pain I am about to describe. And if you believe that the truth eventually surfaces, consider subscribing to the channel. Because sometimes the quietest partners have the loudest receipts. Distance does dangerous things to a relationship. It creates a void. And Claire filled that void with her own narrative. As the years went on, I noticed a shift in the rare text-only emails I was allowed to receive while underway. The excitement of our early days faded into a sharp, low-level resentment. Claire began to complain constantly about the contractors, the vendors, and the daily stress of managing the staff. She would tell me how lucky I was to be hiding out on a boat, free from the real burdens of running a business. I was managing a nuclear reactor that powered a submarine carrying over 100 souls. But to her, my deployments were just a convenient excuse to avoid helping her choose napkin colors. More concerning was the silence from our children. During my brief periods on shore, they seemed distant, mirroring their mother's coldness. If I asked about their college classes, they gave one-word answers. They began making passing comments about how I was never really around to contribute to the family anyway. I did not know it then, but Claire had been quietly rewriting our history. She was feeding them a narrative where my absence was a selfish vacation rather than the agonizing sacrifice that paid for their tuition and their mother's business. I absorbed the complaints. I told myself it was just the stress of the restaurant industry. I told myself that once I retired, once I was finally home for good, things would settle down. I would take over the back office logistics, and we would finally enjoy the empire we had built together. By the time I hit my 20-year mark, my knees constantly ached from walking on steel decks, and my hearing was permanently muffled by the roar of the engine room. But I was finally done. My final deployment wrapped up on a damp gray morning in Washington State. I packed my heavy green sea bag for the last time, shook hands with my commanding officer, and walked down the brow of the submarine. I was officially a civilian. I did not tell Claire exactly which day I was flying home to our town. I wanted it to be a surprise. I pictured taking a taxi directly to the restaurant, walking in through the private rear entrance, and finally being a permanent daily part of the world I had funded. It was early Tuesday afternoon when my cab pulled up to the alley behind our building. The lunch rush was completely over. The street was quiet. I walked up to the heavy steel door that led straight to our shared back office. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my brass key, and slid it into the lock. It did not turn. I wiggled the handle and tried again. The metal ground against the internal pins. I looked more closely at the hardware. The entire deadbolt was brand new. A cold, heavy feeling settled in my stomach. Submariners are trained to recognize when a system is failing, even before the alarms go off. Something was deeply wrong. I did not knock on the door. I walked back to the main street, hailed another taxi, and gave the driver my home address. When I walked through the front door of our house, it was completely silent. Her car was not in the driveway. The living room looked perfectly normal, almost staged. I dropped my sea bag on the floor and walked into the kitchen. The counters were completely bare. But right in the center of the marble island, waiting perfectly aligned next to a cold ceramic coffee mug, was a thick manila folder. I walked over and flipped it open. It was a massive stack of formal legal documents, and right at the top, printed in bold black ink, was a petition for a dissolution of marriage. I stared at the heavy stack of paper on the marble island. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator. I did not panic. I did not throw the coffee mug against the wall. That is not how a chief operates. When you are hundreds of feet underwater and an alarm sounds in the engine room, yelling does not stop a flood. You isolate the casualty, you gather the facts, you execute the procedure. I pulled out a stool, sat down, and began to review the documents page by page. I bypassed the standard boilerplate language about irreconcilable differences and the division of standard household assets. I flipped straight to the financial annex detailing our joint limited liability company. What I saw made my blood run completely cold. According to the petition drafted by Claire's attorney, my ownership stake in the restaurant was listed as exactly 0%. The document claimed that I was a chronically absent party who had never provided meaningful labor or daily management. It explicitly asserted that any money I had transferred into the joint accounts over the past 10 years was legally classified as basic marital household support, not capital investment in the business. There was a separate sheet attached to the back, signed by our longtime business accountant, a man named Davis. The sheet contained a brief financial summary. It asserted that the restaurant had been entirely self-funded through local bank loans and Claire's personal sweat equity. Davis had officially categorized my massive wire transfers. My reenlistment bonus, my hazard pay, and my emergency fund drains were all listed as informal personal loans. The sheet claimed Claire had already repaid them in the form of managing our household during my deployments. She was not just leaving the marriage, she was attempting a total erasure of my existence from the foundation of the business I had built for her. I reached into my sea bag and pulled out my laptop. I attempted to log into our joint bank portal to check the current balances. Access denied. I tried to log into the restaurant's shared accounting software where we kept the daily vendor ledgers and payroll data. Account disabled. Please contact the primary administrator. Claire had spent months systematically locking me out of my own life. While I was standing watch in the Pacific, staring at pressure gauges and counting the days until I could finally come home to her, she was working with Davis to cook the books. She was leveraging a small, overlooked loophole in our original operating agreement. The clause allowed for a partner to be forcibly bought out for a nominal fee, but it required them to be deemed financially and operationally inactive by a majority vote of the managing partners and the certified accountant. She was trying to legally steal the business. She was banking on the assumption that a tired, newly retired sailor would be too broken, too depressed, and too disoriented to fight back against a mountain of legalese. My cell phone vibrated against the marble counter. The caller ID showed my daughter's name, Emma. I picked it up immediately, desperate to hear a familiar, friendly voice. "Emma, sweetie, I just got home." "I know," she said. Her voice was flat, completely devoid of any warmth or excitement. "Mom told me you were finally back." "Emma, what is happening here?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The locks at the restaurant are changed. The accounts are shut down. I am looking at divorce papers." There was a long pause on the line. When she spoke, the words did not sound like my daughter. They sounded like a rehearsed script. "Do not act surprised," Emma said, her tone suddenly turning bitter. "You have been gone for a decade. Mom practically raised us by herself, and she built that restaurant from nothing. You left us alone. She finally realized she does not owe you a piece of the pie you did not help bake." I shut my eyes. The words felt like physical blows. It was not just the cruelty of the statement, it was the exact phrasing. These were Claire's words, carefully planted and repeated over the years until they became undisputed family lore. "Emma, do you really believe that?" I asked quietly. "Did she tell you I paid for the initial commercial lease? Did she tell you my CPay covered the ovens, the payroll, and your entire college tuition?" "She said you sent some money early on," Emma replied, sounding annoyed. "But she paid that all back by taking care of everything here. You were never really here. You were just floating around under the ocean somewhere, pretending your job mattered while she built a real life for this family. You cannot just show up after 20 years and expect to own what she built." She hung up before I could reply. I lowered the phone to the counter. A heavy, absolute clarity washed over me. My family was completely fractured. Claire had not only convinced herself that my sacrifices meant nothing, she had weaponized our children against me. She had spent years telling them she was a martyr, a single mother toiling away while I abandoned them for phantom time on the open sea. And they believed her. Why would they not? She was there every day visibly working. I was just a vague idea, an email address, an occasional phone call with a bad connection. Not because it is easy to accept a lie, because truth requires a paper trail that most people are too lazy to read. Sometimes distance breaks a bond. Sometimes it just reveals that the bond never really existed. I did not try to call Claire. Arguing with someone who has already rewritten reality is a complete waste of oxygen. Instead, I waited. I knew the legal papers on the counter were just an intimidation tactic. They were a low-ball opening offer meant to make me surrender out of sheer exhaustion. To actually remove my name from the operating agreement of the company without my consent, she needed a formal vote on the record. 2 days later, the postman delivered a thick, certified envelope to the house. I signed for it on the front porch and ripped it open. It was a formal, legal summons printed on the letterhead of Davis, the accountant. Claire, acting as the primary managing member of the restaurant, was mandating my attendance at an emergency partners meeting the following Tuesday at 9 in the morning. The stated agenda was simple: a formal vote to officially dissolve my shares due to non-contribution, permanently removing me from the ownership structure. She had included a short, handwritten note clipped to the top page. "Sarah, let us make this easy. You do not know how this business works. Just sign the release, take the $15,000 buyout, and go enjoy your retirement. Do not embarrass yourself by trying to fight." I folded the note and placed it in my pocket. Claire thought she had locked me out of the system. She thought I was just an absent partner who blindly signed checks and had no proof of my own labor. She assumed I would walk into that room angry, emotional, and empty-handed. She expected an easy victim. She had no idea what a Navy chief does when the hull integrity is threatened. When a submarine is being hunted, the commanding officer issues a very specific order. Rig for quiet. You do not panic. You do not return fire blindly. You secure all non-essential equipment. You stop talking. You move in stocking feet, and you wait. You gather data on the incoming threat until you have an absolute firing solution. A civilian confronted with that kind of legal ambush might scream, break down, or immediately hire an expensive bulldog attorney to start a public war. Claire wanted an emotional, messy fight. She wanted me to call her, yelling and crying, so she could prove to herself and to our children that I was unstable. She expected me to react like a discarded spouse who had lost her compass. She needed me to look crazy, so her narrative would seem rational. I gave her absolute silence instead. I did not text her back. I did not attempt to call our daughter again, knowing my words would only be twisted. I simply packed my heavy green canvas sea bag, rented a small furnished apartment on a month-to-month lease near the waterfront, and set up a cheap plastic folding table in the corner of the living room. Then I went to work. Claire and her accountant Davis had made a critical, arrogant assumption. They believed that because they had locked me out of the restaurant's modern cloud accounting software, they had successfully severed my access to the financial truth. They assumed that the digital summary sheet they mailed me, the one framing my investments as an informal personal loan, was the only surviving record of our history. They forgot that a nuclear machinist mate does not trust the cloud. The United States Navy operates a reactor plant on a culture of relentless physical documentation. Every single drop of primary coolant, every valve shift, and every minor temperature fluctuation is recorded in black ink on physical paper, verified and signed by two separate watchstanders. You do not guess. You do not estimate. You log the hard facts. I had applied that exact same paranoid discipline to my personal finances for 20 years. I unlocked my heaviest canvas bag and pulled out a battered, fireproof metal lockbox. Inside was the true history of our business. While Claire had been managing the daily register and choosing paint colors, I had been meticulously keeping a parallel hard copy ledger. Every time I wired my military pay into the joint commercial account, I went to the disbursing clerk on my base and requested a formally stamped physical government receipt. Every month, I printed my leave and earning statements and filed them away in plastic sleeves. I spent 2 days cross-referencing those receipts with my printed bank statements from a decade ago. I laid the papers out on the folding table like a map. I built a chronological timeline of my sacrifices. I found the federal routing slip for my $60,000 reenlistment bonus, matching exactly with the day Claire signed the original commercial lease. I found the hazard pay deposits from my hardest deployments, mapping perfectly to the invoices for the industrial kitchen ovens and the custom bar build-out. But tracing my own money was only half the battle. To completely dismantle their attack, I needed to understand exactly how they were legally justifying my removal. I needed a quiet ally. I picked up my cell phone and called a man named David Vance. David was a former Navy Supply Corps officer who now ran an elite forensic accounting firm specializing in corporate fraud. He understood exactly how civilian accountants manipulated ledgers to hide military income. I brought my lockbox to his downtown office. We pulled the public business filings and the most recent tax documents Davis had submitted on our behalf. It took David less than 2 hours to find the lie. It was a masterpiece of creative accounting. In his official filings, Davis had systematically reclassified my massive capital injections. He did not record them as partner equity deposits. Instead, he labeled every single wire transfer as a personal spousal loan to the business. And then he executed a phantom write-off. He claimed that these personal loans were fully repaid to me through the sweat equity of Claire managing our household while I was supposedly away on my 10-year vacation. It was a brilliant, highly illegal piece of ledger manipulation designed to execute a hostile corporate takeover. It legally zeroed out my financial contribution, allowing Claire to trigger the inactive partner clause in our original contract and sweep my shares into her own account. She thought I was just a tired, broken sailor who would be too intimidated by civilian paperwork to notice the sleight of hand. Not because she was a financial genius, because she assumed I was too exhausted to check the math. The mystery of how she planned to legally steal my life's work was finally solved. But David's financial records were only one piece of the firing solution. Claire was also waging a psychological war. She had convinced our children and the accountant that my service on a submarine was essentially a taxpayer-funded vacation. Because I was not physically carrying plates to tables, she claimed my contribution was meaningless. She had convinced herself that floating under the ocean was easy. I needed someone to formally explain to Davis exactly how easy my life had been. I picked up my phone again and made 2 calls. The first was to Master Chief Thomas Miller. He had been the chief of the boat during my last 3 deployments. He was the senior enlisted man who managed the crew, and he knew every brutal hour I had spent sweating in the engine room. The second call was to Senior Chief Elena Rostova. She had been my divisional leading petty officer. We had stood back to back during a major secondary loop casualty breathing through emergency air masks while we secured a high-pressure steam leak to keep the ship from flooding. I did not ask them for emotional support. I laid out the cold facts, the fabricated ledgers, and the legal mechanism Claire was attempting to use against me. "She is claiming my sea time was a vacation," I told Master Chief Miller. "She is using that to legally strip my ownership." Miller let out a slow, heavy breath. "Tell me the time and the place," he replied, his voice dangerously calm. Elena was even more direct. "I have not yelled at a civilian in months," she said. "I will be there." If you ever found yourself in a situation where the person you loved most tried to legally erase your life's work, would you fight to take everything from them? Or would you simply take back what was yours and walk away? Let me know in the comments below, because that was the exact moral dilemma I was wrestling with as the final pieces locked into place. I spent the rest of the weekend organizing the physical evidence with David into heavy black presentation binders. I rested. I prepared. Tuesday morning arrived with a clear, cold sky. I dressed carefully. I did not put on my military uniform. I did not want to look like I was hiding behind my rank or demanding unearned respect. I wore a sharp-tailored dark charcoal business suit. I pinned my small gold chief anchors to the lapel, a quiet, undeniable statement of who I was. At 8:45, I pulled my rental car into the sprawling parking lot of the restaurant. The building looked beautiful, the morning sun reflecting off the large glass windows I had paid to install. My cell phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was a text message from Claire. "Davis and I are in the back office. The paperwork is ready. Do not make a scene today, Sarah. You know you did not put the work into this place. Just sign the buyout and walk away quietly." I read the text twice. Overconfidence is the absolute enemy of survival. She actually believed I was going to walk into that room alone, look at her forged paperwork, and surrender. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the crisp morning air. A heavy black sport utility vehicle pulled into the empty space right next to me. The driver's door opened and David Vance stepped out with his heavy leather briefcase. The rear doors opened and Master Chief Miller and Senior Chief Elena emerged. They were wearing flawless navy blue suits, looking like absolute concrete walls. They walked over and stood shoulder to shoulder with me in the parking lot. I looked at the heavy steel door of the restaurant's private back office. "Are we ready?" Miller asked, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried the weight of the ocean. "We are ready," I replied. I picked up my stack of black binders. I was not walking into a negotiation. I was walking into an ambush. We walked across the damp asphalt toward the heavy steel rear door of the restaurant. I did not use my key. I simply knocked. A young prep cook opened the door, his eyes widening at the sight of the four of us standing in a tight, silent formation. I asked him politely to point us toward the executive office. As we walked down the narrow service hallway, I looked around at the empire I had funded from the bottom of the ocean. I saw the massive double walk-in refrigerators I had paid for with 6 months of hazard pay. I saw the imported tile in the prep area that cost me an entire re-enlistment bonus. The air smelled of fresh bread and roasting garlic. It was a beautiful, thriving business built entirely on the back of my physical exhaustion. I stopped my team just outside the frosted glass doors of the main boardroom. "Wait here in the hallway," I whispered to David Vance and the two chiefs. "Do not enter until I give the signal. I need her to put the lie on the official record first." David nodded, his knuckles white around the handle of his thick leather briefcase. Master Chief Miller simply crossed his massive arms, his face an unreadable mask of concrete. Senior Chief Elena stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on the glass door. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, alone. The boardroom was a sprawling space, framed by exposed brick and custom oak shelving. Claire was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany conference table, nursing a ceramic cup of coffee. She looked perfectly comfortable. She wore a casual designer blouse and exuded the effortless confidence of someone who believed she had already won the war. To her right sat Davis, the accountant. He had a neat stack of legal documents and a heavy silver pen arranged perfectly in front of him. They both looked up as I entered. They did not look worried. They looked mildly inconvenienced. "You are exactly on time," Claire said. Her tone was patronizing, the kind of voice you use to dismiss an annoying vendor who is asking for a deadline extension. "Have a seat, Sarah. Let us keep this quick and clean." I did not sit down immediately. I walked slowly down the length of the long table, letting the silence in the room grow heavy and deliberate. I reached the opposite end, pulled out a heavy leather chair, and sat down. I placed my single black binder on the table. I folded my hands and looked at them. "Go ahead," I said. Davis cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He pulled the thickest document toward him. "We are here to formally restructure the partnership of the Limited Liability Company." Davis began, his voice taking on a formal, droning cadence. "Per the foundational operating agreement, a managing partner may be involuntarily removed if they are deemed a non-contributing party to the daily operations and the financial solvency of the entity." He paused, looking to Claire for reassurance. She gave him a slight, encouraging nod. "Given the corporate records," Davis continued, "we have determined that your physical absence over the past 10 years constitutes a material failure to manage the business. The early financial transfers sent from your military accounts are legally categorized as standard marital household support. This support was subsequently repaid in full through Claire providing uncompensated labor by managing the home while you were away. It was a masterclass in sanitized theft." He delivered the lie smoothly, wrapping an illegal corporate coup in boring, bureaucratic language. He made the total erasure of my life sound like a simple accounting adjustment. Therefore, Davis concluded, tapping his silver pen against the paperwork, Claire is exercising her right to dissolve your shares for a nominal payout of $15,000. All you need to do is sign the bottom line right here, and your name is removed from the corporate registry. The business moves forward under her sole control. He pushed a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany. It came to rest right in front of me. Silence fell over the room. I looked at the single piece of paper. $15,000 for 10 years of my life. For missed birthdays, for sleeping in a steel coffin, for the permanent ringing in my ears. Claire leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She gave me a sympathetic, deeply condescending smile. I know this is hard to hear, Sarah, Claire said softly. But you have to be realistic. You were never really here. You spent a decade floating around under the ocean doing whatever it is your people do, while I was here bleeding for this restaurant. She gestured grandly around the beautiful office. I handled the contractors. I hired the chefs. I stayed up late worrying about payroll. Claire continued, her voice hardening with genuine resentment. You just had to check your email every few weeks from some comfortable wardroom. You took a 10-year vacation from the real world. You cannot expect to own 50% of a company you abandoned. I let the silence stretch. I let her absolute overconfidence fill the room. In submarine warfare, you do not interrupt the enemy while they are making a mistake. You let them build their house of cards as high as they possibly can. I looked directly at Davis. I want to be absolutely clear, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Are you formally entering into the corporate record that my financial contributions were a personal spousal loan and that my physical absence was a vacation? Davis puffed out his chest, slightly emboldened by Claire taking the aggressive stance. Yes, Davis replied firmly. That is the official certified financial record. And you intend to execute a binding corporate vote on those exact grounds right now? I asked. Claire rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed that I was dragging the process out. Yes, Sarah, we are voting right now, Claire snapped. It is a majority rule and you are out. Stop stalling and sign the paper. You have no legal defense and absolutely no proof that you did anything to build this place. She smiled a tight, victorious little smirk. If you try to fight this decision, Davis will testify that you never put a dime of real capital into the company, Claire added, crossing her arms. Call the vote, Davis. Let us be done with it. I leaned back in my chair. I second the motion to call a formal vote, I replied softly. Claire looked surprised for a fraction of a second, but then her smirk returned. She assumed I had finally folded. She assumed the quiet pressure had broken me. As the majority operating manager, I vote to dissolve the inactive shares, Claire announced smoothly. She looked to her right. As the certified corporate accountant, I concur and finalize the dissolution, Davis said proudly. He picked up his heavy silver pen, lowered it toward the final signature line on the fraudulent document, and smiled. Then the heavy, frosted glass doors swung violently open. David Vance walked into the room first. He moved with the smooth, terrifying momentum of a man who dismantles corporate fraud for a living. Before Davis could even look up from his stack of fraudulent paperwork, David dropped a massive, heavy black binder directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table. It hit the wood with a heavy thud that rattled Claire's ceramic coffee cup. Master Chief Miller and Senior Chief Elena walked in immediately behind him. They did not rush. They moved with the cold, absolute precision of senior enlisted sailors who had spent their entire careers managing chaos. They stepped past the end of the long table and took up flanking positions directly behind my chair. They stood at perfect parade rest, their hands clasped firmly behind their backs, looking like two solid walls of dark blue granite. Claire dropped her confident posture instantly. She pushed her chair back, her face flushing with sudden defensive anger. "What is this?" Claire demanded. pointing a trembling finger at the three strangers. "Who are these people, Sarah? This is a private corporate meeting. You cannot just bring unauthorized individuals into my office." "You called a formal corporate vote," I replied quietly, keeping my hands folded in front of me. "You stated on the official registry that you were legally removing me because my time at sea was a vacation and my money was a phantom loan. I decided to bring character witnesses to verify your official narrative." David Vance popped the heavy brass latches on his black binder. "My name is David Vance," he announced. His voice was crisp, loud, and utterly merciless. "I am a forensic accountant and a former Navy Supply Corps officer. I have spent the last 3 days auditing every public tax filing and bank transaction this limited liability company has ever made." Davis stared at the black binder as if it were an active explosive. He slowly lowered his silver pen to the table. David pulled a thick stack of printed paper from the binder and dropped it directly in front of the accountant. "I hold in my hands certified military disbursement receipts." David continued pacing slowly behind the long table. "They prove that 90% of the initial capital for this restaurant came directly from federal hazard pay wire transfers and a massive reenlistment bonus. I also have the physical routing numbers proving that you, Mr. Davis, systematically falsified the corporate ledgers to classify an enormous capital equity injection as a forgiven personal loan." Davis went completely pale. He looked at Claire, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "Claire," Davis stammered, his voice completely cracking. "You told me she did not have the original bank receipts. You said it was all just verbal agreements." "I do not trust the cloud," I said softly from the end of the table. Claire stood up, her face turning bright red, her carefully composed facade completely shattered. She was cornered, but she refused to surrender. "You cannot prove anything with those papers," Claire shouted, glaring angrily at David Vance. "The money she sent was just basic household support. She was not a real partner. She was barely even in the state. She was off on a 10-year taxpayer vacation. She did not physically work for this company." Behind me, Master Chief Miller slowly unclasped his massive hands. He stepped forward, placing his heavy palms flat on the mahogany table. The wood actually groaned under his weight. "A vacation," Miller rumbled. His voice was not loud, but it carried a terrifying, low-frequency gravity that instantly silenced the entire room. He looked directly into Claire's eyes, locking her in place. "For 10 years, Miller said, his voice dropping another octave, "this woman lived inside a steel tube. She breathed recycled air that smelled like amine and diesel fuel. She slept 3 hours a night in a rack you could not fit your shoes inside. She commanded a nuclear reactor that powered a submarine carrying 140 souls operating under the polar ice cap in absolute pitch blackness." He took a slow step forward. Claire instinctively shrank back toward the exposed brick wall. "During a massive secondary steam casualty 3 years ago," Miller continued relentlessly, "this woman stood in a 120-degree engine room for 20 straight hours. She manually isolated a high-pressure leak so the ship did not flood. She saved the boat. She saved my life." He pointed a massive, calloused finger directly at the forged dissolution paperwork sitting on the table. "And when that casualty was finally secured," Miller growled, "she went to the administration office completely exhausted and covered in grease and wired her entire hazard pay bonus directly to you so you could buy that custom oak shelving right there behind your head." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. You could hear the distant clatter of pots and pans from the kitchen a whole world away. Senior Chief Elena stepped forward next. She did not yell. Her voice was sharp, precise, and cut through the tension like a scalpel. "She missed her children growing up," Elena said, her eyes locked on Claire with burning intensity. "She missed holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries. She destroyed her knees walking on steel decks so that you could play hospitality mogul topside. She is the quietest, most relentless engine I have ever met. You sit here in the air conditioning and call her a silent partner. She was not silent. She was keeping the rest of us alive so she could keep you funded. Elena reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small framed photograph. It was a picture of me, exhausted, covered in black grease, standing in front of a massive steel turbine. She tossed it onto the polished wood table right next to the fraudulent legal papers. Do not ever sit in a comfortable chair in a building she bled for and call her service a vacation again, Elena concluded coldly. Claire was completely speechless. All the color had drained from her face. She looked down at the table, utterly unable to meet the eyes of the two people who had just completely dismantled her reality in less than 3 minutes. The false narrative she had spent years building, the lies she used to justify her betrayal to our children and her accountant, was completely destroyed by the heavy, undeniable truth of the pressure hull. I turned my attention back to Davis. He was sweating visibly, staring at the forensic audit reports that David Vance had placed in front of him. "Mr. Davis," I said. My voice was calm, but the warmth was entirely gone. He flinched. "You are a licensed professional," I continued softly. "You know exactly what happens to an accountant who is caught systematically committing wire fraud to execute a hostile corporate takeover. It is a federal felony." Davis swallowed hard. His hands were violently shaking. "I need you to confirm something for the official corporate registry," I said, leaning forward slightly. "Does Claire have the legal authority to dissolve my shares based on a lack of contribution?" Davis looked desperately at Claire. She stared back at him, her eyes pleading for him to somehow hold the line to fix the disaster she had created. But Davis was a survivor. He knew exactly when the hull had fatally ruptured. "No," Davis whispered, his voice trembling. "No, she does not. The corporate financial ledgers were manipulated. You are an equal equity partner." He reached out, picked up the single sheet of dissolution paper he had just asked me to sign, and slowly, methodically ripped it perfectly in half. Claire slumped back into her heavy leather chair. The fight completely left her body. The smug, overconfident woman who had sent me that mocking text message that morning was entirely gone. In her place was someone who suddenly realized that her entire legal argument was dead, and the quiet sailor she had underestimated had completely cornered her. The boardroom fell dead silent again. Master Chief Miller and Senior Chief Elena stepped back to their positions behind my chair. The truth had finally surfaced. I held all the cards. I had the undeniable audit the witnesses and the absolute power. Davis was waiting to be fired. Claire was waiting to be destroyed. They both looked at me, expecting me to scream, expecting me to demand total, immediate control of the company and throw Claire out onto the street with absolutely nothing. I looked at the beautiful empire I had paid for, and I reached out to close my black binder. They were waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for me to act like the resentful, unhinged spouse Claire had painted me to be. They expected me to seize the entire company, drag them into a decade of brutal litigation, and salt the earth behind me. I did none of those things. When you finally achieve total control of the battlefield, revenge is an unnecessary expenditure of energy. I looked at Claire. She looked incredibly small, sitting at the head of that massive mahogany table, her eyes darting nervously toward the ripped paperwork. "I am not going to steal this restaurant from you," I said softly. Claire blinked, a flash of genuine confusion crossing her face. "I am not you, Claire." I continued, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I do not steal what other people built. You built the menu. You built the staff. You managed the daily grind, and you did it well. This place is your dream. It was never mine. My dream was simply coming home to a family that wanted me." I reached into my blockchain, pulled out a single, perfectly typed document and slid it across the long table. It came to rest right in front of her. "This is an ironclad, non-negotiable buyout agreement," I explained. David audited the true current valuation of the restaurant. He calculated exactly 50% of that value, plus a full restoration of the initial capital I injected over the last decade with standard interest. Claire looked down at the number printed at the bottom of the page. It was a massive sum. It was enough to fully fund my retirement, but mathematically fair enough that the business could survive the payout if she structured a commercial loan. "You are going to take that document to a real bank," I said, my tone shifting back into the cold precision of a Navy chief. "You are going to secure a legitimate commercial buyout loan. You are going to transfer that exact amount into my personal account by the end of the month. The moment that wire clears, I will sign away my shares forever, and the company is entirely yours. You can run it however you want." I stood up, slowly adjusting my dark suit jacket. "But if you try to stall, or if you try to negotiate that number down by a single dollar," I added, looking directly at the terrified accountant, "I will hand David's forensic audit over to the federal authorities, and Mr. Davis will lose his license before lunch. Do you understand?" Davis nodded frantically, his face pale with absolute relief that he was being given an exit strategy. Claire stared at the document, entirely silent. "You win, Claire," I said, quietly turning to leave. "You get the restaurant, but you do not get to keep the lie." I walked out of the heavy glass doors, flanked by Master Chief Miller and Senior Chief Elena. We walked back down the narrow service hallway, out the rear steel door, and into the bright morning sunlight of the parking lot. I shook hands with David Vance. He nodded grimly, slid his heavy leather briefcase into the back of his sport utility vehicle, and drove away. I turned to my two old crewmates. "Thank you," I said softly, the adrenaline finally beginning to leave my body. Master Chief Miller put a massive hand on my shoulder. "Anytime," Chief Miller said. "Do not let topside civilians convince you that your sea time did not matter. We know who kept the lights on." They climbed into their own car and pulled away, leaving me standing alone in the quiet lot. I felt a profound, heavy sense of relief. The pressure hull had held. A week later, I had a very difficult conversation with my adult children. I did not yell, and I did not demand apologies. I simply set the black binder on a small dining table in my apartment and invited them to read the physical receipts of their tuition payments, the hazard pay ledgers, and the truth about the forged corporate documents. It was hard for Emma and my son. Watching the myth of their mother's martyrdom collapse under the weight of hard evidence was a painful process. But truth is a powerful corrective. Slowly, over many quiet dinners in my small apartment, the ice began to thaw. We stopped talking about the past and started building a real relationship in the present. As for Claire, she secured the commercial bank loan. She wired the exact buyout amount into my personal account on the 29th of the month. I signed the release papers electronically, severing myself completely from the business and the marriage. I heard through the local grapevine that the massive new commercial loan she was forced to take out squeezed her operational margins entirely. She was suddenly working twice as hard just to keep the lights on, finally experiencing the crushing financial pressure I had quietly carried for a decade. Not because I punished her, because sometimes the harshest consequence you can give a person is simply making them carry their own weight. I took my money and bought a small, quiet house on the coast of Washington State. I spend my mornings drinking coffee on the deck, watching the ships roll in. I am surrounded by facts by the ocean and by absolute peace. If there is a lesson in this, it is about true contribution. The people who quietly fund the foundation are rarely the ones standing on the stage taking the applause. When the world tells you that your quiet sacrifice does not matter simply because you were not visible, do not try to convince them with emotion. Let them build their arrogant narrative. Rig for quiet, gather your receipts, and let the undeniable truth surface when they finally overplay their hand. If you have ever had to fight to prove the value of your invisible labor, how did you finally make them see the truth? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe that the quietest partners eventually bring the loudest receipts, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more stories of quiet vindication. I will see you in the next one, where a wealthy mother-in-law assumes a retired paramedic cannot read a legal trust document.